Hi, this is Brian Simmons, here to talk about module number 5 of interpersonal communication, an overview of interpersonal conflict. If you're like most people, there's probably a person or two in your life that you seem to often find yourself in conflict with. When you were living at home, it probably was one or both of your parents, and certainly your siblings. As you get older, it could be the person you're dating or the person you marry. For many people, it's someone they work with, a supervisor, or perhaps a coworker. The fact of the matter is, conflict is a natural part of life. And some people, like myself, really hate conflict. They'd like to avoid it and do whatever they can to keep it out of our lives. For other people, they seem to thrive on it. In fact, some of you might know someone, or you might be someone, who really enjoys conflict and goes looking for it. Those people annoy me, and maybe you too. But the fact of the matter is that all around us is interpersonal conflict. And because interpersonal conflict is so woven into the fabric of our lives, researchers have tried to study how it works. And they've been able to identify a number of research findings that help illuminate what conflict is, how it works, and therefore how it might be best managed. And so, for the next several modules, we'll take a look at that academic research on interpersonal conflict and talk a little bit about how it develops, how it can be avoided, and most importantly, how it can be managed successfully. So, let's take a look at this module, which is what we've called an overview of interpersonal conflict. Let's start with this. If you think about your life, it's probably true that there are certain kinds of people, in fact, certain individuals with whom you tend to have more conflict, and other people that you seem to get along with fine. There seems to be little, if any, conflict whatsoever with them. Well, one of the things we've said earlier in this class is that context matters, that the context in which the communication occurs often heavily influences how that communication works. And so with conflict, what we find is that as the context changes, so too does the likelihood and the negativity of that conflict. So for example, on the one hand, you have people that you work with, your coworkers or your casual friends. These two contexts are contexts where there's relatively little interpersonal conflict. In particular, in the research, the people we work with are those we are least likely to have conflict with. Now, there are many reasons for that, chief of which is the fact that in a workplace setting, there typically are different expectations and different rules that act to sort of box in the conflict. There are certain things in that dynamic that help people not have conflicts. They're typically highly visible. You have to be with these individuals for a period of time, and there's an expectation of decorum and professionalism in most jobs that prevent people from having conflict. So when it comes to coworkers, there typically is relatively little conflict. Now, that's not to say there's never any conflict with coworkers. Certainly there is. And in organizational psychology, there is research that finds that certain kinds of jobs tend to have more conflict than do other jobs. For example, blue-collar jobs tend to have greater conflict between coworkers than white-collar jobs. But that said, generally speaking, coworkers is an example of a kind of interaction where you're likely not to have a lot of conflict. On the other hand, you're likely to have more conflict with your friends. Now, the research here is mixed. It very much depends upon the kind of friend you have, meaning a best friend or a long-term friend or that kind of a thing. But generally speaking, if you have less conflict with coworkers, you're likely to have more conflict with friends. And one reason for that is because we get to know our friends often much better than we get to know the people we work with. And in a friendship, some of those dynamics in a workplace setting that tamp down the conflict are no longer present. And so in friendships, oftentimes a gate is open to allow greater levels of conflict than there otherwise would be. Now, that's not to say you always have conflict with your friends, because like everything else in this course, the communication is heavily influenced by your personality, your background, particular experiences you've had, your gender, all kinds of influences. But in the big picture, generally speaking, if you have this much conflict typically with coworkers, you're likely to have more of it with friends. And if we narrow that down even more, we can begin to find gender differences. So, for example, females are more likely to have conflict with their female friends than males are with their male friends. Comparatively speaking, females have greater conflict among their friends than do males. So, a third kind of a context is a family context. And if you have some conflict with coworkers and more conflict with friends, the research is very clear. You tend to have a lot more conflict with family than you do friends or coworkers. And there are lots of reasons for that. One reason is because typically in conflict with family, you know each other so well. You know which buttons to push, you know the things you can recall that you can point back to that cause a conflict. You just simply have to live with them under the same roof. And those kinds of interactions tend to give rise to greater levels of conflict. Now, what's interesting is where romantic relationships fit into all of this. Research here is quite mixed. Some romantic relationships have much more conflict than others do. If you start off as friends and then transition into a romantic relationship, it is not at all uncommon for there to be greater levels of conflict. In fact, file that away, because if right now you're friends with someone and you're thinking of transforming that relationship into a romantic one, be on the lookout for the fact that as you transition into romantic partners, you are likely to have greater levels of conflict and more frequent conflict. And so that shouldn't scare you. Once you've made that transition from friends into romantic partners, it's quite normal for there to be conflict. So if you experience that conflict after making that transition, don't think that it's not going to work. Don't think that that's a harbinger of bad things to come, or that the two of you are doomed as romantic partners and have to go back to being friends. That's not the case. Instead, it's simply to say that the different distributions of conflict between friendship and romantic relationships is such you have to be aware of it. At any rate, in the big picture, I'm simply trying to make the point that in the research, a crystal clear finding is that there are different kinds of contexts, and those contexts tend to lend themselves to different likelihoods and manifestations of interpersonal conflict. Now, for many people, they think that any kind of a conflict, or in particular, highly charged conflict, is always going to be a negative influence on any kind of a relationship. Doesn't matter whether it's family, people you're dating, friends of yours. For many people, any kind of a conflict is always a bad thing. In fact, many people have broken up romantic relationships because they will say, we fight too often. Well, that may be the case. In the research, there's a bit of a more nuanced view. Let me say two things about conflict and healthy relationships. Because at the end of the day, what we all hope is that the relationships in which we find ourselves are healthy. And so in the research, one of the things we find is that there's a clear relationship between well-managed conflict and the strength of the relationship. Now, let me stop and say a couple things before I press on. First, one of the things in the research is the distinction between well-managed conflict and poorly managed conflict. Poorly managed conflict, regardless of the context, regardless of what else is going on, almost always results in something negative, some kind of a detriment to the relationship. On the other hand, well-managed conflict doesn't have to be negative. It doesn't have to harm the relationship, and in fact, can be quite beneficial to the relationship. And this is one instance. One of the things we find is what's called a curvilinear relationship between well-managed conflict and the strength of the relationship. Now, what I mean by a curvilinear relationship is this, that as the conflict increases, there is a benefit to the relationship and that the relationship gets stronger. In other words, the more conflict you have that is well managed, that is natural, that organically grows from the relationship, the stronger that relationship becomes. So imagine a graph that goes up, 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 up. But it gets to a point where once you have more conflict, that benefit begins to diminish. And so you end up with a U-shaped kind of a pattern. That's called a curvilinear relationship. And so even if you have more well-managed conflict, that's not going to increase the strength of the relationship. Or to put it differently, there's a point of diminishing returns right there, where if you have more conflict, the relationship's not going to get any stronger. So the key then is for the relationship to find the sweet spot, the point where everyone involved in the relationship has enough conflict to strengthen the relationship, but not so much as to become detrimental. Now, why does well-managed conflict result in a stronger relationship? And the explanation for that in the research runs like this. The well-managed conflict allows the individuals in the relationship to get to know one another better, and it gives them a kind of contained arena in which to experience some friction, but it allows them to recover from that friction in such a way as to strengthen the relationship. It's almost like saying, if I want to build muscle, I have to do push-ups or lift weights. And while there is resistance and there is a bit of difficulty in the lifting of the weight or the doing of the push-up, ultimately the body is stronger. And so in a similar fashion, well-managed conflict can in fact have a positive effect on the strength of a relationship. We also know this, that there is a clear positive relationship between well-managed conflict and the depth of the knowledge of the people you're involved with in that relationship. So this is more like a diagonal kind of a line where we say the more well-managed conflict you have, the more you get to know someone, the deeper that knowledge is, which in turn correlates in the research with a lot of positive outcomes in relationships. Now, I guess you could say that the research suggests that the more conflict you have that is well managed, the more you get to know someone. So maybe I should just have a lot of conflict. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't work quite that way. There are so many other variables that go into a healthy, successful relationship that it's not as simple as saying, just have more conflict, you'll get to know people. What we find is that conflict often arises out of the kinds of things about which we didn't know about someone. That's especially true in the early stages of a romantic relationship. Now, the reason I share this research with you about the relationship between well-managed conflict and the depth of relational knowledge is to give you a flavor for some of the research that finds that conflict can in fact be a very good thing. I'm trying to dispel the notion that all conflict is bad. That's not the case. The key is not whether there's conflict or not. The key is, if there is conflict, is it well managed? And if it is well managed, there can be some positive outcomes that come from that conflict. But if it's not well managed, then obviously it's detrimental and it's something that needs to be addressed or even avoided. So having said that, let's talk a little bit about what's called a conflict progression. If you think about it, consider the relationship with your roommate. The two of you might have a kind of a situation where there are different grades or different levels of the severity of the conflict. So what researchers have done is they've identified 4 different levels of conflict. The first and the lowest level is what we might call tension. In tension, there's just this kind of sense that you and your roommate have some kind of a thing that's bugging you. Maybe your roommate isn't cleaning the bathroom as often as he or she agreed to. Or maybe they leave food and messy dishes out on the sink and never put them in the dishwasher. There could be something there that's an annoyance. It kind of bugs you. And so there is this tension between the two of you. And in that particular situation, we have what we will call in the next module latent conflict. There's something between the two of you. It's like a rock in your shoe. It bugs you, but it's not the end of the world. And so in the first grade or first level of conflict, tension, what often happens is you just know that you have some kind of a problem with someone, but you don't talk to them about it. You don't argue about it verbally. You don't act passive aggressively, though you might. But generally speaking, it's just there beneath the surface, waiting to boil up into something else. And then when it does boil up into something else, you have the second level of conflict, which is what we would call friction. Now, friction is when you have bickering between people. Think of you and your sibling, perhaps when you were younger, or maybe even right now. You say something, they say something back, and it's a very quick 2 or 3 turn exchange. That's bickering. Or you might be sniping each other, where you just make a real catty, snarky, sarcastic kind of a comment, and they respond with something, and then it's done. Or there might be this kind of disagreement where the two of you voice strong opinions, but it never really rises to the level of argument. That friction is important because what we find is that when you move from the tension degree to the friction degree, you're more aware of the conflict. And so when you're more aware of the conflict, you begin to associate conflict in that person, or you begin to associate a particular issue with conflict in that person. So in this case, if you walk into the kitchen of your apartment and you see dirty dishes all over the sink, you might make a couple of sarcastic or snarky comments to your roommate. Your roommate then says something back to you, and you're experiencing friction. What happens the next time you walk into the apartment and see dirty dishes is it triggers your mind to go back to that previous exchange of sarcasm and snarky comments. You begin to associate the dishes, the roommate, and friction. The longer friction goes on, the more comfortable two people become in interacting this way, which oftentimes leads to the third level, which is what's called functional conflict. Now, functional conflict is probably the most common type of conflict that you think of when you think of interpersonal conflict. This is when a couple is arguing. This is when parents are fighting. This is when you and your roommate are having this really knockdown, drag-out fight where yelling occurs and you're emotionally invested. That is what most people tend to think of as really messy, ugly conflict. Now, it doesn't have to be that way, but the point is, compared to tension, compared to friction, functional conflict is out and out arguing. It's fighting. It's the kind of thing you think of when you think of conflict. And the main key to understanding functional conflict is that it might be well managed or it might not be, but it's not inherently dysfunctional. Or to put it differently, it's not abusive. It's not over the top. It's not the kind of thing that does long-term psychological, emotional, or physical damage. That's the fourth level or the fourth grade of conflict, dysfunctional conflict. This is when people are verbally abusing one another. This is when there's clear emotional abuse and manipulation. This is when there's physical abuse. This is the kind of thing that sweeps up domestic violence. This is the kind of thing where parents are treating their kids horrifically, illegally, and highly unethically. This is at the end of the spectrum where you need to get out, where it will do immediate and often irreparable damage. It's called dysfunctional conflict for a reason. So those four levels, from tension to friction to functional conflict to dysfunctional conflict, all have their own little nuances and particular research findings that we'll talk about. Now, to be fair, we'll spend most of our time talking about the first three stages. The fourth stage oftentimes gets into a different area of research that we're not going to talk about in this class. Dysfunctional conflict has its own challenges that are beyond the realm of an interpersonal communication class. But the first three levels, the tension, the friction, and the functional conflict, is what we're going to talk about. And the lens through which we'll see all of this conflict research is what's called a stage progression lens. So let me talk about that briefly, and then we'll wrap up this module. Researchers have tried to find the commonalities among all conflicts. It might surprise you, but there's a lot of research that says that most conflicts tend to unfold in the same way. That is to say, they tend to begin, to grow, and to end in much the same way. Now, some of those conflict episodes might take place over an hour or so. Others might take place over a few moments. But what researchers have found is that there are discernible, identifiable stages that can help you understand how conflict works. Or to put it differently, if you and your roommate are going to have an argument about the dirty dishes that were left in the sink, there is a clear stage. There's a first stage that transitions to a second stage, and a third, and a fourth, and a fifth stage before that conflict episode is over. So the first stage might begin at 10:15 when you walk into the room after your class. You see the dirty dishes. The two of you make sniping comments to each other. It escalates, and then it de-escalates, and the conflict episode is resolved at 10:25, 10 minutes later. What researchers have done is they've identified clear-cut stages that show you how that conflict began, how that conflict began to grow, and then finally how the conflict ended. So what we're going to talk about over the next couple of modules are the different stages in interpersonal conflict, because a lot of researchers have found that within each of those stages are clear communicative behaviors that allow us to be able to understand what's going on in each stage. And the idea then is that if you understand what's going on in each stage, that creates a situation where you can know what's coming. And if you know what's coming, then you can better handle it. Or to put it differently, once you know how communication works, you're in a better position to be a better communicator. So in the next couple of modules, we'll talk about the research on interpersonal conflict and trace each of those stages from beginning to end.